Bands of guerrillas operated in the countryside, destroying French transport and supply depots. The guerrillas would attack French soldiers who wandered off alone or were separated from the main group.
They were ambushing them. Every chance they got, they would shoot at the patrols and they would go by, and using guerrilla tactics.
Zaragoza would not be able to lead the guerrilla fight for long.
After Puebla, poor Zaragoza, he didn't live long enough to enjoy his victory. He died of typhus shortly after, about 3 months later.
He became a martyr almost immediately. He died that very same year, and he was buried in Mexico City with huge ceremonies.
Zaragoza's heroic leadership at the Battle of Cinco de Mayo would be honored by Juárez, who renamed the city Puebla de Zaragoza. 9 months after the Battle of Puebla, the French army had received 25,000 reinforcements, armed with the newest artillery.
They had learned their lesson not to underestimate the Mexicans, and when they again headed westward from Veracruz, they made a point of bringing back a much heavier army and one with much better equipment.
To avenge their earlier defeat, Napoleon III replaced General Lorentz with the more capable General Fauré. General Ortega was chosen to succeed Zaragoza. He had 22,000 Mexican troops to defend Puebla.
Any Mexican nationalist who really cared about the independence of the country would have been in the ranks at Puebla, or at least sympathizing with the men who were in the ranks at Puebla resisting the French.
On March 23, 1863, the French attacked Puebla for a second time. Fauré would not make the same mistake as Lorentz and decided to attack the city from all directions. 1 week into the battle, the French captured the fort on the outskirts of Puebla and moved to the city. But the defense of the city remained strong. Even after a month of fighting, the French still did not control Puebla. The fighting continued and evolved into street-to-street combat. Churches, homes, and convents were used as defensive barricades. The battle raging in Puebla continued on through the 1-year anniversary of Cinco de Mayo. The president had declared Cinco de Mayo a holiday. In Mexico City, even with the French on their doorstep, the first national celebration of the holiday took place. But in Puebla, there was no celebration. The city was under siege. After 3 months of fighting, food was running low. All supply lines were blocked. Facing starvation, General Ortega had no choice but to surrender.
This was a man that endured a siege. His food and water ran out. He decided to surrender Puebla and then proceeded to destroy all cannons, rifles, and guns so that they would not fall into the hands of the French to be used against Mexico.
12,000 Mexican soldiers were taken prisoner. Many were put to work on the new railroad the French were building in Mexico. Others, facing the prospect of forced labor, switched sides and joined the French cause. To prevent them from rallying new troops, nearly 1,000 captured Mexican officers were sent to prisons in France. Porfirio Diaz, former hero of Cinco de Mayo, managed to escape. He rode to Mexico City to warn Juárez, who had only 6,000 troops left, that the defense of Mexico City would be impossible.
It was difficult, but being Juárez, he managed to turn it into a memorable moment. He made a very fierce speech to the Mexican legislators, and he said, "Adversity discourages only inferior people." And with that, he left the capital and vowed that he was going to return.
As Juárez prepared to leave the capital, he kissed the flag and whispered, "Long live Mexico." On May 31, 1863, Juárez evacuated the capital and moved the government to San Luis Potosí, a town 400 miles to the north. Juárez had one last hope, that Lincoln and his U.S. neighbors to the north would help him drive out the French.
Juarez and Lincoln certainly empathized with each other. Both men had come from humble backgrounds, and both of them had been engaged in civil wars, trying to reunite their countries and trying to bring about the sort of nation they believed should exist. Unfortunately, the political circumstances, especially the international political circumstances during the Civil War, prevented that alliance from growing closer.
With the U.S. unable to help, the French marched into Mexico City uncontested. The victory on Cinco de Mayo, just 1 year before, is now a distant memory. The French are now rulers of Mexico. France emerged victorious after a 13-month war with Mexico. The crown was offered to Napoleon III's ally, the Archduke Maximilian from Austria.
Maximilian was very much the classic European gentleman. He considered himself not merely the Emperor of Mexico, but also a Habsburg. He was a member of the oldest and most prestigious ruling house in all Europe. Maximilian's future in Austria would not have taken him to the throne of the Habsburg Empire. To use our modern language, if he'd been on track to be emperor, he wouldn't have given it up to take a secondary position in Mexico. This was the only emperor's job he was going to get, and he was quite happy to have it.
Maximilian would rule Mexico with his wife, Carlotta, but the experience would eventually drive her to insanity. But in the spring of 1864, the mood was optimistic as Maximilian and Carlotta, with great fanfare, departed on the Novara from their home in Italy to the port city of Veracruz, Mexico. Arriving 2 weeks early, the welcoming committee was nowhere to be seen.
I think it was very disappointing for them. You can read in the diaries and everything that the first time they came to Mexico and they were on the ship and they saw Veracruz, they said, my goodness, this is our country, this is where we're going to live.
As the couple began their 250-mile journey to Mexico City, they passed through Puebla, site of the Cinco de Mayo battle. In Mexico City, they were greeted by the conservative Mexican elite.
There was a grand religious ceremony, speeches by the bishop, the archbishop, Mexican officials, and politicians, and they were given the keys to the city.
The traditional presidential residence at the National Palace had been prepared as their new home, but Maximilian preferred a more regal setting. He transformed Chapultepec Fortress, a former military academy, into a castle befitting an emperor.
It's very imperial, and it's on top of a hill, and it overlooks the city.
No expense was spared. The new architecture even paid tribute to Napoleon III.
The French took Mexico City, but that still didn't mean that they'd taken Mexico. This is a huge country of hundreds of thousands of square miles, and the countryside refused to be controlled.
Guerrilla activities against the French invaders continued. The French soon created contra-guerrillas, headed by Louis Dupin. Their response to guerrilla activity was swift and brutal.
Underneath La Mission Civilisatrice, underneath this great civilizing mission of France, there was always a large amount of violence and very brutal violence.
The contra-guerrillas took no prisoners. Any guerrilla captured was immediately hung. Civilians suspected of collaborating with Mexican troops could expect to see their homes burned. But Maximilian had no desire to rule Mexico with an iron fist.
He was interested in learning the language, the music, getting close to the people, traveling around. Many of the presidents didn't even bother to leave Mexico City. He wanted to become part of Mexico.
He appeared to be an eccentric. And indeed, he was an eccentric man. In touch with the indigenous groups, the fact that he was interested in studying the native Nahuatl language. He also had a great interest in nature. He had an interest in the great variety of insects and animal life not found in Europe. You could say to a certain extent, he acted very much like a hippie.
Carlotta took to maintaining the household and concerned herself with the formalities of holding a royal court.
They would have these beautiful dances, you know, and they had big bands playing for them, and they were enjoying life, you know. They had plenty of money.
The extravagant state parties and balls, along with maintaining the royal household, were costly. Maximilian spent extravagantly as well, but his goal was to modernize Mexico. Telegraph lines, new roads, railroads. Mexico's debt doubled, and its already delicate finances worsened. These costs would soon threaten Maximilian's rule. Maximilian was also losing support among his closest ally, the Catholic Church. The liberal Benito Juárez had placed strong restrictions on the church, and Maximilian refused to restore its power.
Maximilian had some ideas about Mexico that were actually a bit more liberal than those of most of his supporters. He probably would have liked to see a Mexico that was a bit less unequal than the Mexican conservatives.
The people who brought him were disappointed because he was not very easy to maneuver. I mean, he didn't do what they wanted him to do.
Maximilian now had a more serious threat. He was losing the guerrilla war with Juárez. After a year in power, Maximilian still did not have control of the entire country. Guerrilla fighting continued throughout Mexico, and the liberals were only going to get stronger now that the U.S. Civil War was over.
On May 17, 1865, Ulysses S. Grant summons to his headquarters in Washington General Philip Sheridan, probably the Union's most renowned cavalry commander, and he gives him an order. Sheridan is to take 50,000 men and proceed to the frontier with Mexico along the Texas border. Sheridan is directed to conduct himself as if he were preparing for an invasion of Mexico. Secondly, there is going to be a massive movement of armaments. 30,000 rifles alone left the Baton Rouge, Louisiana arsenal. In addition to that, artillery pieces will be shipped across, everything from mess kits to bayonets, and all of this is going to be delivered directly to the Juaristas.
For Maximilian and Carlotta, time was running out. On January 15, 1866, Napoleon III wrote Maximilian and told him that he was withdrawing his troops because of mounting financial pressures and the threat of a major conflict with the United States. The French were giving up their empire. Juárez and the exiled Mexican government were confident that Cinco de Mayo would again be celebrated in Mexico. After a 4-year intervention in Mexico, French troops began to withdraw from the country, leaving Maximilian alone to maintain his empire.
He and Carlotta certainly tried to fulfill the role of emperor and empress, but the entire project was probably doomed from the start. The Mexican people did not want them, their Mexican supporters could not sustain them, and the only thing propping up the regime was the French army.
In a desperate effort to find support for her husband, the Empress Carlotta left Mexico City.
She's going to go to Europe. She went to talk to Napoleon and try to get Napoleon to send French troops back because Maximilian didn't have enough troops.
But Napoleon III flatly refused to help. Fearing for her husband's life, Carlotta pled her case to other royal families, none of which would help. Carlotta, without hope, begins to go mad.
I think I can understand part of what happened. She had this entire marvelous world constructed around her, the world of the Empress of Mexico. And then as soon as the French prop was kicked out, the entire stage collapsed around her.
In a final effort to appeal for help, she took her case to the Pope, Blessed Pius IX.
And she told the Pope to help, urging the Pope to help. As a matter of fact, she got so upset that she became very paranoid, and very sick.
In her madness, Carlotta became convinced that Napoleon III was trying to poison her. Pope Pius would not send aid to Maximilian, but he took pity on Carlotta, who had obviously gone mad. She was allowed to stay and is believed to be the only woman to have ever officially spent the night in the Vatican. Without the support of the French army, Napoleon III knew the empire in Mexico would not stand. He encouraged Maximilian to abdicate, but Maximilian refused.
If you believe in something, you live for it and even you die for it. And Maximilian and his people, they were willing to do it.
On February 13, 1867, Maximilian set off to meet his trusted generals, Miramon and Mejia, in the town of Querétaro, to establish their military headquarters and to confront the advancing liberal army.
De acuerdo a la información que tenemos, Maximiliano llegó a tener alrededor de 9,000.
From the information we have, Maximilian came to have around 9,000 troops. But Juárez's army, integrated with the Central Mexican Army, the Mexican Army of the North, and the Mexican Army of the West, had more than 50,000.
On May 15, 1867, Querétaro was overrun by the liberal forces. Maximilian and his two remaining loyal generals were captured. On June 14th, 1 month after their capture, Maximilian and his two generals were found guilty of treason and sentenced to death.
The President of the United States, through our Secretary of State, had sent requests to Juárez asking that the execution not take place. This was similar to appeals that had been received from other heads of government. Juárez resisted all of these. He was convinced that there was a very fundamental and basic issue at stake here. That issue was the penalty that foreigners were going to have to pay for intervening in Mexico's affairs and trying to dictate to Mexicans the course of action that their nation was going to take.
On the morning of June 19th, at Cerro de las Campanas, a hill outside Querétaro, they would face the firing squad.
Preparen!
At the execution site, Maximilian asked that his face not be disfigured so his mother could see him one last time.
When they were getting ready to execute him, he told the firing squad, I have a last request. So they asked him, what do you want? I want some mariachi music. So they sent for a mariachi, and he wanted to hear Las Golondrinas. And he said that was his wife's favorite song. He stood up there before the firing squad and said, I hope you forgive me. I have forgiven you. Que viva la independencia, que viva México.
Honoring Maximilian's last wishes, a guard delivers a coup de grace and shoots him in the heart, saving his face from disfigurement.
First and last, a Habsburg always does his duty. If he is the ruler of the nation, then it is his duty to serve the nation and, if necessary, to die for it. When he went to his execution, he really didn't have any regrets. He did not ask that his life be spared. He was an emperor, and just as importantly, he was a Habsburg. And so he died.
The Novara, the same ship that had triumphantly carried Maximilian and Carlotta to Mexico less than 4 years earlier, would return to Europe, this time carrying Maximilian's corpse.
Carlota lived in Belgium for many years. She died way into the 20th century. And she is another kind of tragic figure in the folklore of Mexico.
Carlotta, mired in madness, would remain unaware of her husband's death, even to the time of her death 60 years later in 1927.
Fueron víctimas de los intereses de Napoleón.
They were victims of Napoleon III's interests.
Víctimas de los intereses de la iglesia al querer recuperar sus
They were
bienes.
victims of the church that wanted to reclaim their power. And finally, they were victims of their own belief that they could rule a country like Mexico that was in chaos.
It was the end of the empire, but it was a new beginning for the Mexican Republic. Juarez triumphantly re-entered Mexico City, where he would be president for the next 5 years until his death. During his presidency, Juarez would reestablish the celebration of Cinco de Mayo.
We beat the most important army in the world of that time. So all the other battles, they seem to go in the shadows. People don't think about them, people don't remember them. It's the Cinco de Mayo, and the date itself, it's very symbolic. The city of Puebla began making it their own celebration. The people from Puebla took it as something very personal and something very close to them, and they make even bigger celebrations every year.
Básicamente, las celebraciones se hacen exclusivamente en la ciudad de Puebla.
The celebrations are held exclusively in the city of Puebla, while in the United States, Los Angeles, New